I'd like to say a few words about us. Demos was created in 2000, back in the days when Cato, Heritage, American Enterprise Institute, etc., seemed to be the only voices speaking on issues like, big government. And they spoke so darn loud, in fact, that as you may remember, the last Democratic president of the United States declared the age of big government to be over more than a decade ago. To return to Demos, it was one of a number of groups formed around the turn of this century to act as a counterweight to the free marketeers and the privatizers. And for quite a while, what we did was to paraphrase William F. Buckley at an earlier juncture in our ideological journey, to stand athwart history, or what seemed like history, yelling, "Stop!" These are better times. Tonight's discussion is one sign of that. The title of Jeff Madrick's book, The Case for Big Government, is one sign of that. Demos is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization. We work with activists and advocacy organizations around the country in pursuit of four large missions. One is democracy reform, specifically as an example, Election Day registration and enforcement of the National Voter Registration Act, especially the provisions that have to do with registering voters at public assistance offices, which some states have not wanted to do, but which, thanks partly to Demos' efforts and the efforts of many other organizations, a number of states have been doing a better job of lately, with the result that more than 100,000 new low-income voters were registered at public assistance agencies in the months leading up to this last election. The second mission is economic justice and opportunity, reducing economic inequality. The third, which is represented by a program known as Public Works and is very directly relevant to tonight's discussion and book, is to create a new respect for government as a tool of the common good and to help make government newly worthy of that respect. And our fourth mission is for the United States to re-engage with the world as a global citizen. I want to acknowledge the two co-sponsors of tonight's talk, which are the Bernard Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and the Century Foundation. And I want to turn the podium over to Greg Anrig of the Century Foundation, who, like our speaker, is into gutsy book titles. He wrote one called The Conservatives Have No Clothes last year. And Greg.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Jim, as well. The Century Foundation is always happy to partner with Demos on our shared mission. Off his endowment, although it's shrinking really fast, so we're trying to hang in there and keep his agenda alive. Not very long ago, any publisher would have been out of their minds to title a book "The Case for Big Government." It's something that I think would have been widely recognized as not conducive to book sales. And yet now here we are today, and it's very clear we're already in a new era of big government, even before the Bush administration has left, with the $700 billion partial nationalization of the banking industry, an industry that was widely viewed as emblematic of the virtues of markets. And the reason why the banking industry had to be nationalized by conservative, anti-regulatory Republicans is because of the failure of their belief system to achieve what was promised from that belief system. And if you just look at the case of banking in its own right, and look at the time frame involved, banking deregulation began in 1980 in earnest under Jimmy Carter, actually, the same year that Ronald Reagan became president. And it continued through the years that followed, even after the savings and loan debacle in the late 80s, early 90s. The Glass-Steagall Act was repealed under Bill Clinton in 1999, supported on a bipartisan basis by people who believe that markets work better than government. Government needs to get out of various realms of the economy. And then even subsequently, efforts to try to regulate financial derivatives, predatory lending practices in housing, highly leveraged financial institutions. All those efforts were rebuffed rather right off the bat by people like Alan Greenspan, but also Democrats like Robert Rubin and Larry Summers. And what we're seeing now today is the upshot of that belief system failing in practice. And here we are. We do now have very clearly a period of time where government is going to be much more involved in our economic life. It has to be, because it's quite clear that that ideology has failed, and the banking example is just one of many. Jeff Madrick has been making the argument against conservative approaches to governing and in favor of more energetic and thoughtful approaches to governing for many, many years now in different capacities. And if you look back at his previous books, what he's written in the New York Review of Books, what he's written for in connection with Challenge Magazine and the great journalism that he's produced there, the Levy Institute, the New School, the Century Foundation. He's always right. He's everything. If you look back at what he's written, it holds up. And so I hope everybody will listen carefully to him this time, as I think he has a very prescient book, and one that will help guide the new administration in ways that will lead to much better outcomes than we've experienced of late.
That's so kind. Thank you, Greg. I'm sure that's the first and last time anybody will ever say I was always right. Thanks very much to Demos. Miles just came in, and the most energetic man in the public policy field. Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for that. And, of course, thank the Century Foundation, Dick Leone and Greg, who I work with often on projects and who's written a very good book himself. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it a lot. This book was not written or not started anyway during a period. In fact, it was by and large finished by the time the credit crisis was well underway. It emanated from some lectures I had begun 3 and 4 years ago, as you can imagine. It was not written in anticipation that I would be speaking here as the Dow Jones is heading towards 700. Now, I, like countless other people, anticipated there could be a debacle. But what was already clear was the times were not good for a very long time in America in many respects, and I want to return to that. But what this book is essentially about, and it was, I think, written in anger, but also with a kind of a sense of futility until this very moment, this very historic moment, so to speak. It was written in anger because we were living in the Dark Ages, and as often as you said, we need some light thrown upon us, you were disregarded. I also did a column for the New York Times as a contributing columnist, and Bob Frank is here tonight, and he does this same column on a rotating basis. And I found in those years, I'd be interested to talk to Bob a little bit about this, I was hardly a favorite son at the New York Times. They were looking very much for conservative writers who wouldn't be as naive as I was, or look back longingly to the 1960s in vain for hope that government could actually be an answer. Grow up, be modern, all that kind of thing. Well, the grown-ups have not been in charge, in fact, for 30 or 35 years. We have been living in a dark age. We've been living in an age of ideology, and I use that word carefully. It's a faith-based ideology. It's not an evidence-based ideology. And at the end of this talk, I will not propose has been an ideology that constantly and repeatedly told us government can't do this. Government's the problem. Government is usually bad. government is the problem, not the solution. I can't, people always ask me, how did this ideology begin? If it was just an ideology, if something else existed before it, where did this spring up from? Well, it's quite clear to me it began in the 1970s under the pain of inflation and simultaneous high unemployment, a very difficult decade. It was something I think we have to admit, most of us here are progressives, it was something of a reaction to the social strains of the 1960s and the efforts of government in the 1960s. I am a big fan of what happened in the 1960s. It too has gotten very bad press in recent years, and I constantly read wise journalists and essayists in popular media today talking about what failures there were in the 1960s, or how we learned that big government was such a problem in the 1960s. Of course, most of these people I read have no memory of the 1960s, and I suspect they have read very little about the 1960s. The 1970s were a turning point. It was the ascendancy of ideas like Milton Friedman's, who was an outcast, essentially an outcast, though he was president of the American Economics Association, essentially an outcast in mainstream economics until the 1970s. He was president of the AEA in 1967. He wrote a book in 1962 called Capitalism and Freedom, a really compelling, simplistic book that sold very few copies, that was not reviewed by any major publication at the time, and has since sold something like 1 million copies. And as a journalist, I got to interview him quite often. He took very special pleasure in the fact that that book was so little regarded in the early days. It became a kind of Bible and highly influential by the late 70s and early 80s. What happened then was some politicians, some policymakers, got hold of this idea and convinced the American people that government was the problem for their inflation and their unemployment. And the people eventually bought it. To some extent, events were on their side. But the causes of inflation and unemployment back then were very complex. Government deficits we've had bigger government deficits, and inflation has remained very low since then. Government deficits were not the issue. Money supply, the creation of money supply, a rather tortured argument back then, was not the issue, at least as a causal factor. It was complicated. But by the 1980s, Ronald Reagan cemented it. He told us government was the problem, and he did it with remarkable eloquence, consistency, and simplicity. Pretty soon, the ideology took hold. And it didn't only take hold as an idea, it permeated us. It reached our gut as a nation, the gut of the people. And nowadays, I still have students who tell you all government programs are bad, with anger. With anger. In New York. Pretty tough stuff. The distressing thing was the Democrats climbed aboard. So, as Jim said, it was a Democrat who announced the end of the era of big government in 1996. It was the Democrats who, clearly the Republicans led the way in deregulation, but it was the Democrats in the 1990s who sealed the deal. Even before Glass-Steagall was formally put asunder, it was no longer effective on a de facto basis, partly because the Democrats were aboard. No need for that deregulation. But now we know the Democrats also supported the idea, at least Bob Rubin and Larry Summers, along with Alan Greenspan, supported the idea that derivatives should not be regulated by Washington. They clearly supported the idea that capital controls should be removed internationally. Larry Summers was very aggressive about this. The Bush administration, of course, was worse. We could go into this time and again. I kind of get a kick out of this Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac episode, but I think it's fair to say it was George Bush who got that law from being passed that would have controlled it a little more closely, because he wanted to privatize Fannie Mae altogether. In any office to manage the U.S. government. And then there was, of course, the early Bill Clinton, the most symbolic statement of our time, I think, the end of the era of big government. The substance of this book, as I say, it was partly written in anger. The substance of this book is not a theoretical case for the intervention of government. It's not about economic theory. There are good theoretical arguments in economics in favor of government intervention. There's the argument of public goods, that some goods are social. Their benefits are enjoyed by many of us, not just a single company or consortium of companies, and therefore we have to invest in them as a society. Education is a classic example. Transportation infrastructure, another one. There's behavioral economics. There's information economics. Some of these are starting to penetrate mainstream economics. But I find them subject to interpretation, ambiguous at least in their use as applied to public policy, and therefore not adequate to the task of what we've got to do today. I think what I tried to do in this book is make the empirical case for big government, not the theoretical one. What do the facts tell us, pure and simple? And there's 3 areas that are quite clear about this, despite Fred Thompson and Dick Armey and Martin Feldstein and Robert Barrow, more prominent and rather serious economists, who keep telling us reduce taxes and productivity will grow faster. Reduce taxes will get more income per capita over time. And yet when serious economists look at, now we have a lot of data, cross-country comparisons, data of what other countries are doing so we can compare. And lots of economists do that. Some people see things one way, some people see them the other way. But I think when serious economists do these cross-country comparisons, they come up with the simple fact. There is no relationship when you look at the governments, particularly in Europe, that have more government spending as a proportion of their GDP or higher taxes than we do on average. No relationship between bigger government and economic growth. I cite in particular the work of Peter Lindert, who wrote a book, and not a particularly left-wing economist, I don't think, a mainstream economist who works at the University of California at Davis. But there are many other studies that show this. Lindert, I think, I like to cite a quote from Lindert, who wrote in a book called Growing Public, "There is a dramatic conflict between intuition and evidence. It is well known that higher taxes and social transfers are unemployment insurance, health care, poverty programs, and so forth. It is well known that higher taxes and social transfers reduce productivity. Well known, but unsupported by statistics and history." Lindert juggled this data over and over again, 90 years of data every which way, and he found a zero relationship. In other words, high growth, high government and high taxes do not undermine productivity growth. That doesn't mean that big government and high taxes mean you'll get rapid productivity growth. But it does mean that there's something going on in nations with high taxes and lots of government spending that seems to support productivity growth, not the great, let's call him the great-great-great-great-grandfather of that notion. Except that Thomas Jefferson was a great regulator. When Thomas Jefferson was head of Virginia, and Virginia owned all that land. The states owned almost all the land in America. When the Union joined, the states had to cede the land to the federal government. Jefferson said he'd only cede the land if there were regulations about the distribution of that land that made it accessible in small amounts at reasonable prices. He was a land regulator. We had one of the most radical land reform, land distribution policies you could imagine. Couldn't possibly fit into the modern ideology today. Jefferson, the great anti-government, the mythological anti-government man, was the progenitor of that policy. And of course he bought Louisiana. And you know what? Jefferson didn't want to build roads because he felt federal government couldn't do it until he saw the economy starting to develop in the early 1800s. Then he had his guy, his Treasury Secretary, the reputedly brilliant Albert Gallatin, devise a roads and building plan for $20 million that was very extravagant, very comprehensive. The embargo of 1807, 1808 intervened. Jefferson left office. We had a war with England. That plan went asunder. But guess what? The Republicans, Jefferson's own party, said, we need roads and bridges. And people like DeWitt Clinton went home to New York and started investing in the Erie Canal and so forth. The states built the canals. New York State financed the Erie Canal beginning in 1817, 1818, finished in 1825. Many followed, made New York City a boomtown. Why did they do it? Practical reasons. We needed the commerce. They financed it. And what about our primary education? There was a battle in America over whether we should have public education. The people, especially in Massachusetts, fought for a free primary school system beginning in the 1820s, relatively few years after America was born. And, you know, there was a tuition charge. It wasn't all paid for by property taxes then. There was a tuition charge to send your kids to school. And in 1828, Massachusetts abolished the tuition charge and made it entirely free so that everybody could go to primary schools equally. By 1850, more American kids were going to primary school as a proportion of that age group than in France and England, and we were spending more per capita per kid. We were spending more per kid than France and England. It was an extraordinary achievement of government. The list goes on. In the 1800s, the technical and agricultural extension universities were formed by land donations from the federal government. It's not merely that the government gave MIT a little plot of land on the Charles River, or Berkeley in California, or Ohio State, or Cornell, and some of the other 30 or 40 universities that were started that way. I may even be understating the number. They let them take that land and sell it to finance themselves, universities. The land donations to finance the railroads. I happen to think the railroads were not developed in anything remotely looking like an efficient manner in America. It was a mess. There were huge, huge bankruptcies time and again in railroad development. I wouldn't have minded some government coordination. It reminded me a lot of Citibank's takeover of the recycling of the petrodollars 100 years later. I'm, needless to say, not in the minority on this view on the railroads. People hardly write about it. But nevertheless, the federal government financed about half of those railroads through land subsidies, land giveaways. One thing we don't think about very much, the development of the sewage systems and the water systems in the cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Local government, vaccinations, local government. The healthcare systems were enormously important. Then there are the high schools. I mean, I sometimes think when I talk to people around the country, they think the high school was just built standing there on the corner when they were born and must have been there somehow or other in the colonial years. Government had to make a decision to build the high schools. Why did they make a decision? One reason was a commercial reason. People had to get better skills to be part of the economy. People wanted it so they could get good jobs. Business wanted it so they could get good workers. And part of it was a democratic ideal. Free high schools, get everybody involved. And it was a revolution, especially for women in going to high school in the early 1900s. The rapidity, I don't quite remember, so I better not repeat it, of female graduations in high schools was quite extraordinary. It rose from something like 10% to 50% in a matter of 20 years. It was an amazing revolution. We all know about after World War II. We're hearing it endlessly now. The highway system, the internet through the Defense Department, the subsidy of the GIs to go to college. It goes on and on. The remarkable work by the National Institutes of Health. We are still today the leading research country in pharmaceuticals, not because big pharma gets all that, makes all that profit, in my view anyway, that contributes, of course, but because we have a great educational system and medical research system supported by the National Institutes of Health. We have great researchers. I want to say one other thing I don't often talk about. Government contracts have been enormously important to innovation in America. The first very important one was back the Springfield Armory in the 1840s and 1850s. The Army gave the Springfield Rifle Factory a dependable contract, may have been the early 1850s, a dependable contract to make rifles. The Springfield Armory said, we're not going to make rifles the old British way. We're going to try and mass produce these rifles. We have this money coming in. We can invest a little bit in innovation. And they invented the system of interchangeable parts. That is to say, you make every part similarly, and you can have a production line to put that rifle together. The British came over, and even the Japanese even then came over and were astonished. We could make so many more rifles, just like Adam Smith's pins, so many more rifles per hour per worker than they could. But it was a government contract that did it. And it was government contracts even up to this day that support so much industrial, so much innovation in general. I like that interchangeable parts story because people always think Henry Ford's big contribution to the world was the moving assembly line. And as I read the history of Henry Ford, the big contribution to was interchangeable parts. Nobody believed, and I shouldn't say it was the big contribution, but this was a key piece of his being able to make cars so productively. He was a bicycle guy, bicycle mechanic. Until they used to make bicycles with interchangeable parts, but probably there may be 200 parts in a bicycle you have to make interchangeably. The car requires 5,000 to 10,000 parts. Nobody but this crazy guy believed you could make all those parts interchangeably. Didn't think we had the tools to do it. It was sort of the lunacy of genius that led him to think we could make them interchangeably, and that was a key step towards the assembly line of the rapid reduction in hours needed to manufacture cars. You can see that I don't talk about that story very much in this. I don't think I mention it at all in this book, but I'm taken with it. There's one other piece of evidence besides our own history that supports the use of robust, pragmatic government, and that's the failures of the last 30 to 35 years. We've had this ideology in place, and look what's happened to the U.S. In particular, what I find stark is the stagnation of male wages. In fact, the mainstream has climbed aboard this, finally, I'm glad to see. People like Isabel Sawhill are talking about how personal incomes of men in their 30s, typical men, the median, are lower than typical male personal incomes were 35 years ago, once you discount for inflation. Think about that. That's probably unprecedented in American history that wages, personal income has stagnated for that long. It'll probably even since the early 1800s, but certainly since industrialization. We've had lots of ups and downs, as we know. two-worker family is the norm in America, and we have no national high-quality, affordable pre-K education system. The analogy is primary school. The analogy is the high school. Back then, we needed primary school. Things changed, we needed high school. Things changed, we subsidized college. I myself think we should make college still more affordable. Maybe we'd have to control it the way we control GM. Costs are out of hand. But now we know a lot more about the needs of children, and we know a lot more about this unequal society that hasn't been able to break this perpetual poverty trap. We know kids benefit a lot from early education. There are controversies about that also. But we know a heck of a lot about that, and we do nothing fundamentally about it. We do a little bit about it in the state and local levels. We're not building the institutions the nation needs to move on. Healthcare, wage stagnation. Notice I didn't bring up inequality because I'm actually more taken by wage stagnation than I am by inequality. And one of the silver linings of the Wall Street crisis is probably wage inequality has narrowed, for at least for a moment, certainly wealth inequality. Do you know how bad our broadband penetration is compared to other rich nations? How we have far fewer people subscribing to the internet than most other rich nations? Again, probably easily attributable to an ideology that led to a kind of regulatory system that's enabled monopolies and duopolies to control broadband use in the country. Again, a reflection of what I think of the dark ages of a destructive ideology, a destructive, impractical ideology. That's the case. It's an empirical case for government. What do we do? Where do we begin? Is Obama, the moderate man, going to do anything? My one feeling about Obama, for what it's worth, and I don't think it's worth very much, but I don't think many prognoses about Obama are worth that much at the moment. We got to see. My sense of him is he's not a dogmatist. You know, he has Chicago people around, he has Reuben people around. I'm a little concerned he doesn't have many other kinds of people around. But my sense is, this comes from his reading of one book called Unequal Democracy, about which not all of us will agree about everything, by Larry Bartels. But it's a very empirical book. It's a book full of surveys, it's a very evidentiary book, and I'm kind of interested that you can pick out what you want from that book. It's based in evidence. You might disagree with the interpretations. Maybe I'm placing too much weight on that, but my sense is Obama is a pragmatist. My warning to us, before I talk a little bit about what I think we should do, and I probably shouldn't go on too much longer, but my warning to us is that the enticement of power is pretty great. So I think it's going to be a little bit too easy for some of us as like-minded people to, well, I may be dead wrong about this as I think about it, but I just feel like we may get co-opted a little bit by the Obama administration to adopt moderate ways, because these are the guys in power, and we might even get a job out of it. And power is pretty enticing. So it's a word of caution that we shouldn't give up our principles, because they're quite soundly based. Robust government is called for. Fears of deficits right now are not particularly wise, I don't think. So, back to the credit crisis. I do think it's very much a function of ideology. There's an ideological pushback. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did it. The law that required commercial bankers, I guess it's commercial bankers, to give mortgages to low-income people, that did it. It's all a bunch of preposterous nonsense as far as I can see, but it shows you the ideology does exist out there. If you've done some radio shows recently, as I have, you're always hit with this kind of thing. And George Will says it on Stephanopoulos every other time he speaks, I think. It was government intervention that created the problem. The government, Fannie Mae bought subprime mortgages in 2005. The subprime mortgage wave was underway in 2001. Nobody asked investment banks to borrow 30 and 40 times their money. Nobody asked the commercial banks to develop these structured investment vehicles off the books, so to speak, so they could invest in these fancy mortgage vehicles, make an eighth of a point, borrow like crazy at low rates in the commercial paper market. None of that came out of from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or a very, very small portion of it did. This was a financial community run amok. It's quite clear, and this is not new. The idea that there's systemic risk in America, in the financial community, Alexander Hamilton knew about it. Alexander Hamilton knew that finance was different. It's partly why he wanted a bank. Even Andrew Jackson, who did away with the bank, knew that there was a contagion in financial communities, easy contagion due to speculation that could bring a whole economy down. That's not new. What's new is people learned to undermine it. We developed a Federal Reserve Bank to control part of that system. It controlled a large part of that system. Gradually, the people involved learned to undermine the control. And now a large part of the money supply is created by institutions that are not controlled or regulated or even overseen by any Washington regulator. But this is not new. The 1800s were very much like this in many respects. We learned to regulate it. Then, in the last 30 to 35 years, under the weight of this ideology, which I consider an imprisonment, we unlearned that we had to regulate it. We have to regulate it again, much like we did before, in broad principle. Some restrictions on leverage, oversight, exchanges, or at least transparent trading of these vehicles and so forth. But there's one other problem. And I get a little upset with progressives on this issue. It's not merely a matter of telling people, oh, this is a systemic problem, we may even need global regulation. We have a very serious agency problem in America. It's what economists call an agency problem. The people who are making the decisions, what's motivating them to make those decisions? So I hear all this talk about risk management, that, these people were supposed to manage risk and they let us down. They didn't know how to manage risk. The problem was the managers were not at risk. And it's very important to understand that. That phrase that was popular in Wall Street, IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Take the money now and run. It wasn't a matter of limiting, restricting, and allocating risk carefully. The impetus was take on as much risk as you can, because you're going to take the money home today, and the music's not going to stop for a few months, a few years, and maybe even longer than that. So the motivation for the decision makers was neither in the long-term interests of these banks, nor in the long-term interest of the nation. And that has to be dealt with frontally. I don't have an easy suggestion about how to do that, but I think progressives in particular have to be thinking about that carefully, because we can't destroy the entrepreneurial attitudes in finance. But we somehow have to align the financial motivations of these decision makers with the long-term good of those firms and the long-term good of the country. My view is even bigger than the credit crisis is the wage crisis in America. Let me just go quickly. I'm one of those people. I've been saying it for a while. A lot of people are saying it now. We need a very big stimulus, because just making the banks whole is not going to solve the problem. That's an old Friedman versus Keynesian problem. You can make the banks whole momentarily, but you can't make people borrow the money unless they think they're going to do some business. And they're not going to think they're The stagnation of wages in some, low wages is inevitable. And I think, keep in mind, one reason healthcare is so painful is because wages didn't go up. One reason people can't pay their mortgages is wages didn't go up in the 2000s. If they went up only by 5 or 6%, people would have a couple of $1,000s more a year to pay their mortgages. Do the arithmetic, divide by 12. That's not an inconsequential sum of money. One reason education costs seem so expensive and out of hand is wages haven't gone up. And the only reason the main reason family incomes have gone up is the spouse has gone to work put in ever-increasing hours in the job, and we don't provide institutions to help her or him do that. So I'm going to stop here. I have a little optimism about Obama. I tend not to give upbeat talks, so I wanted to end saying this. I have a little optimism about Obama. And I'd be happy to answer some questions if I can. Should I just take them? Okay.
This is a bit of a tangent, but when you see when you see the automakers today asking for bailouts, do you not think of Dr. Deming in 1945 and how they all ignored him except for Don Peterson at Ford?
Well, I know that you love that guy, and I kind of like him too. Deming was the guy who, went to Japan and I think helped the Japanese learn how to make high-quality cars, and there's a Deming Award in Japan and so forth. They tended to ignore him and adopt pure mass production assembly techniques in the U.S. So yeah, I'm in that camp of thinking automotive companies are not managed well, but they also had their own mass production ideology. They had their sunk costs. Ford tried to do that stuff. I don't know enough about why all of that failed, but yeah, in general, if the question really is auto management bad, I think it is. Does that mean we shouldn't bail them out? I think we probably should bail them out, but I think there should be, again, this is an example of an ideology we're fighting. So is the Paulson bailout. The would include raising taxes on the middle class. That would still put us well below the tax rates in European societies, 10 percentage points below of GDP below European societies, and they're doing darn well.
It's fine to talk about a more robust government. However, there has to be a more effective government, a less politicized government. By political, I don't mean policy-oriented, but where people who are involved in politics run government rather than professional in the specific field to some extent. And what can be done to develop a culture of professional public service that views effectiveness and loyalty to the quality of the job over whatever the political connections dictate?
Well, I think that's a very good point. Again, I'm a little bit optimistic that Obama thinks along these lines. And I think that, the indirect influence of the president in this regard and the direct influence can be quite... We've had attitudes at the top that so undermine, especially in the last 8 years, that so undermine the quality of government. We got people in charge of government agencies who don't believe in government, who in fact think those agencies should be weakened or shouldn't even be there. So we've, in particular, the last 8 years had bad government, but it started with Ronald Reagan. Lots of bad people in government. I think government's hard to run. There's not a lot of money around. I was talking the other day in Massachusetts, and somebody was saying, why aren't we making these public policy schools better? Are they really training people to go into government? And somebody next to me said, raise the salary. Change matters. Yes, sir.
Can you just say your name and affiliation before you ask your question?
My name is Jim DeVore. I'm unaffiliated. I appreciate and enjoy your talk a great deal, but I'm wondering one other element in terms of the ideology or anti-government ideology that perhaps is not given a full focus is the kind of concern, best, by the way, epitomized by George Wallace, who used to talk about pointy-headed liberals, who were telling people what to do and how to live their lives. And in some extent, that's in Alito's testimony when he was going for the Supreme Court, and these people going to Princeton who are going to direct his life. And I'm wondering, and I'm concerned that some of the folks entering the Obama administration, I think that's going to be a struggle, are sort of guilty of Michael Bloomfield, a Bloombergism, of the kind of thing that we have that we're the smart people, we're the adults, but we're liberals, and we're the government, and we've come to help you. And a lack of a democratic ethos. And I'm wondering what you think of that and what we might do to promote that democratic ethos.
I think that's a very good point. I think there's got to be a lot of listening and a lot of, one of the fears I have in the rush to the stimulus plan, for example, is that it won't be well thought out enough. The worst thing, the thing that Obama has to do, and the easiest mistake to make, is to adopt programs that don't work, that don't do what's promised for people, which is I think partly what happens when you don't listen to people enough, a little bit like when you don't do your
able to run his own government without being too much intervened by Clinton people.
Well, I'm worried about that. The thing I believe about Obama, and this may be wishful thinking, and I immediately go back to being 12 years old and with all my hopes about JFK, but I kind of think Obama's his own man. He's not gonna hire people even in cabinet positions and then say, you develop the policy and I'm going to go with it. So I am worried there are too many Clinton people there. In some sense, that's all the Democrats have is Clinton people. You know, they're the only ones who worked in government. They're knowledgeable. So he's something of a box. I do worry, and I worry actually more about foreign policy even than domestic policy. But I think, you know, I don't think it's foolish of me to think there's something special about Obama, and he will make practical decisions, not dogmatic decisions, and he won't allocate the responsibility to all of those people and just go blindly with them. I think there'll be mistakes, and you know, I can imagine myself on in some march on Fifth Avenue someday during an Obama administration, but I think maybe it's going to go well. Miles? Miles is with Demos.
Yes, I'm with Demos. I do think that the kind of the ultra free market fundamentalism that we've had for the last 25 years has been pretty well discredited by the thing. But I do think that there's going to be a new argument, and I'm just curious about between the sort of cautious budget balancers, whether it's the Concord Coalition or the Peterson Foundation or the people who are basically going to be advising Obama and the Congress. You can't do too much, you can't spend much money. Where's all the money going to come from? It was really interesting in the debate. Every single debate, the moderator said, how are you going to spend, how are you going to find all the money? What are you going to cut in order to do this? And so that was a certain, you know, assumption. And on the other hand, there are some people who are beginning to call for much, you know, more deficit, more spending to get us out of this rut. How do you come down on the argument, and how would you make the argument?
I think that becomes a political argument out of necessity. I do believe we got to spend a lot of money. I think we've got to drop any concern about the deficit in the near term for the reasons I mentioned early on. How do you make the political argument? I think one of the things that encourages me is that it's not Paul Krugman who's making the $500 or $600 billion argument, although he stated it the other day. He was late in the game. Goldman Sachs economists had been talking about that 6 weeks before. $300 to $500 billion, Goldman Sachs was saying. I think the PIMCO economists on the West Coast, you know, Bill Gross, they were talking, I think, I didn't see it myself, $600-700 billion. Feldstein. So there is a movement, not just, you know, of crazy left-wing economists by any means, but of the establishment. And these are the guys on the line. The bondholders, Goldman Sachs, sunshine in the Feldstein corner every once in a while, I suppose. You know that Feldstein was on the board of AIG. Does everybody know that? Not only was I on the board, he had a very high position on the board of AIG. I wish that would come out, actually. But so I think there may, you know, what I'm trying to say, Miles, is I don't have an answer to that. But I think there may be movement in that direction. It may. You remember when I was slightly involved in that process, when the Democrats at the end of 2007, early 2008, came out with a deficit spending program because it began. And I remember the Edwards people were the first who wanted to go out with the spending program. And I got a phone call, would you recommend, what kind of stimulus would you recommend? And I did, and I said, we need 1%, you need 1% of GDP, $125 billion. I certainly was not the only person who was saying that at the time. I think they were taken aback. I think Edwards' first proposal was, what, $25 billion of stimulus? Within a few weeks, people were talking about $80 billion and then $100 billion and $125 billion. So, I think at least momentarily for the stimulus plan, we may be talking, we may get there out of necessity. And then the question is, do we get out of this as rapidly as we think? The big argument, of course, for spending more now is you really going to save care so we can pay our debts in the future. It's a part of this ideology. They get away with this kind of thing. Let me just, Bob, I think, had his hand up first, and then we'll go to the other two people.
My name's Bob Frank, and on the question of how to pay for it all, yeah, it was appalling that the debate moderators kept posing that question when it was so clear that you don't want to pay for anything right now. You just want to spend as much as you can. But I think in the long run, it is necessary to come to grips with how you pay for all this stuff. Much of it would be permanent. And I think it's a good opportunity to forge agreements on raising taxes after growth resumes. It's always hard to raise taxes at any moment. People always find it hard to save extra money at any moment. But there's been a nice experiment in the private sector where people who aren't willing to contribute to 401k plans this year are willing to promise to increase their contributions out of their next raise. So they don't have to cut back anything now. A fraction of their next raise goes in. I think the Obama team could extract promises from Congress to raise taxes once income growth resumes, not just raise taxes of the sort we have now, but they've already begun speaking intelligently about taxing different sorts of things. The cap and trade proposal speaks of taxing the carbon content in goods and services that are offered. A great idea. It would produce lots of extra benefits, but not now. Have pledges be enacted now that when growth resumes will increase those taxes. I think that would quiet all this anxiety about the deficit running up with the extra spending. Another comment I would offer was on the auto bailout. I absolutely appreciate your concern about the industry's own role in getting itself into the fix that it's in, but it seems to me in the short run it's a very strong case to go ahead with an auto bailout. That's over 1 million jobs. It would be very hard to do a Chapter 11 that would probably end up in a liquidation in the auto industry because they wouldn't be able to really reorganize and continue operations, whether consumers would even consider buying cars from a company that was in a liquidation procedure, probably not. But saving a job is a really valuable thing. It's just as valuable as creating a new job. Right now, it's a real conundrum. How can we create new jobs quickly? Because there's this anywhere from $300 to $600 billion shortfall in demand. How can we have government spending step in and create new jobs? It takes a year to get things up and running. These are jobs that already exist, and if you keep a job from being thrown out, that's just as good as creating a new job. And it would be really cheap to keep 1 million jobs from getting thrown out for the next 3 years. You would just have to throw, I don't know, 25, 30, $40 billion. That's way cheaper than you could create that many jobs in any other way.
Yeah, I think that, but I agree with that also. $25 billion is a lot of money, and it's not a lot of money in light of what we're spending and losing in the financial markets. What's kind of interesting is how angry the American public is at the auto companies. It's pretty interesting. Americans feel let down in a serious way, and they were angry at Wall Street, buying SUVs and, you know, investing like crazy, and then, but there was some little, there was anger brewing under the surface, clearly. But I do think in the long run we have to think somewhere along the line about rationalizing that industry some. And these guys have had a very hard time thinking in the long run. And some of that has to do with picking up healthcare costs maybe over time. Some of it has to do with restructuring their pensions somehow. I don't think I think it's going to be a tough do, but I hear what you say, a $25 billion injection at a time when the economy fell out of bed, to be resisting giving them that, to allow them to at least get their act together. But then let's talk. I think there should be some agreement that then we talk about restructuring as a quid pro quo for that and any more money to come. We'd raise the ante for AIG by $25 billion like that. Bob?
My name is Bob Davis. I think I am a derivative of your Rangers fan. That's my affiliation. I understand your worry and I sympathize with it. What I can't tell is how much control you think government policy has over the depth and the length of the crisis. I mean, it's clear what you think we ought to be doing, but what kind of results and how fast do you think it would have?
Well, you know, I don't believe much in forecasting. I do think that what we do know is we're falling rapidly. What we can assess is openly about varieties of control. We talk about it very guardedly because of a long-standing ideology we shouldn't be involved in. I think we have to break that down. I don't have a good answer about exactly how that control should work. We should be very clear that Paulson's haphazard federal bailout is inefficient precisely because of this ideology he's worried about. Should we really be telling the banks what to do? Should we be, this and that? And it's hurt the country seriously. At first I was actually defending the guy because it was such, we were in such unknown territory. I give the guy a break, and then you realize he's just imbued with this idea that we can't do this to them, we can't give them the money. And I think maybe he even believes, a la Greenspan, that they'll just work it out on their own. Greenspan is going to become one of the great tragicomic figures of history, I think. That apology was it's just mind-boggling to me that he ever really believed he had a model. To say there's a flaw in the model presumes he had a workable model. And then to say he had 40 years of evidence that proved it was right, after we had an S&L crisis, a residential mortgage crisis, an Asian crisis, long-term capital management, the 87 market, which he kept having to bail out. And then he says, I have 40 years of evidence that they could manage their own risk because competition works, So
freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and at least some degree of free enterprise, we have a monopoly public school system that does not give parents choice, where there's no natural monopoly involved?
isn't there don't parents have control over their school system? Don't they elect when I went to school, we went to Douglas Montgomery. We had they ran the schools. Needless to say, the city, yes.
Actually, as a parent and county and grandparent, the answer is no.
So there you have it from an authority.
Government officials have control over the system. If you like it, if you don't like it, you are rich, you pay your own way.
Let me say this about for schools, okay? I think it would be a nice idea if everybody could participate in that market on a fairly equal basis. I think it's very hard to implement. I think where we've had choice, the results have been ambiguous. I think history suggests that the public schools have worked very well in America for a very long time, and clearly they stopped working at some point very well. In some areas, but in many parts of the country, the public schools do work very well. The test scores are good. We have an unequal system. So I don't think it's a simple matter of monopoly. I think if it is monopoly, in many cases the monopoly has worked pretty well. Do we need reforms? Do we need fresh thinking? Yeah. Am I going to stand here and say I'm an expert in those particular issues? No. But I think the implication of what you're saying is that our public school system has been a failure, and in fact it's been a remarkable success.
I didn't say whether it was a failure or not. I focused on the question of free speech, freedom of religion, and freedom to conduct a business. And
I don't know the laws. Aren't you allowed to educate your child at home?
Yes, you can. You have a choice between paying for the education of your child however you see fit and sending the child to the free public school. It's as though you had a choice between buying a newspaper that you liked and getting the government newspaper, which is free. That's not freedom of speech. In Brooklyn, not too far from here, some people here have heard of Brooklyn, there's a sort of natural experiment going on in the field of education where religious Jews won't send their children to the public school for religious reasons. They want their children to be taught by people who are exemplary of the values that they hold dear. So they send them to religious schools. And those religious schools operate on a competitive basis. There are scores of religious schools with different ideas, different price systems, different schedules, different systems of education, and parents pick and choose between them. Whether they're more effective or less effective than the public schools, I don't know. But the main question is, in a society that prides itself on freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and doesn't squelch business for the sake of squelching business. How do we justify a monopoly public school system that is at least partly geared...
Let me answer that question in a general way. Because I think it is a quality of school issue. I do not think it's a freedom issue. In general, freedom has been used by all sides in political arguments to support themselves. Freedom was used, because I do think you're making a political argument, freedom was used to support slavery after the failure of Reconstruction. People were free to own their property. So when you... This is true. I mean, I don't know if the laugh was just to mock me or to claim it wasn't true. It is true. Freedom has been used by Milton Friedman, needless to say, Capitalism and Freedom, to claim we shouldn't pay Social Security taxes. We should have the freedom to invest where we'd want to invest. Well, and save for our own retirement. Imagine all those people who would have had the choice of saving for their own retirement perfectly free and seen their retirement package fall apart by 50% or something in the last few days. Freedom is not a simple matter, and there are lots of debates about freedom. There are sophisticated debates about positive freedom and negative freedom, and do you have to give people certain skills? And so this is a complex debate that cannot be reduced to a simple matter of freedom of speech and freedom of choice. And I get a little nervous when people think it can be reduced to that kind of argument. Our society is too complex, and we've fought these battles over and over again in American history. We've done pretty well. I don't think we're doing very well right now, partly because we have overemphasized a very narrow definition of freedom. Yes, two more. Did I miss anyone?
Harold Zulo, social and economic psychologist, and question
unaffiliated.
Right. And I have a question for you as well as some comments in response to Bob Frank's comments and your replies, and a couple of caveats. One is that with the potential use of the financial bailout money to be picking winners and losers, and the rise that we're likely to see in people's frustration, punitive attitudes, concern that there could be risk of punitive attitudes being used under guise of ideology and in effect to pick winners and losers, that studies of people's views of punishment show that people look to a just desserts kind of model, the idea that people need to be punished to get perspective view of negative reinforcement of behaviors that we would want to negatively reinforce among the automakers, but going forward in a prospective way that won't create a vicious cycle as we suffer from the fallout from punitive measures that are going to have the impact of picking winners and losers. That's one concern that I have based on some comments I've heard tonight as well as in the media. Another thing is that I agree with you about the importance of intelligent stimulus now, and that could have an impact as quickly as possible. But also I'm not hearing so much about longer-term impacts, and to help to guarantee that, first of all, that we don't get a double dip kind of economic downturn, and secondly, impacts that are going to continue to be felt throughout Obama's administration beyond, and to be reversing potentially some of the changes that we've had in recent decades, including what you've talked about. So hoping that we would also see in form of stimulus addressing decline in human and social capital, reversing some of that in a way that could bear fruit within coming years. And then the question I was going to have for you, Jeff, is that you had said before that you feel that wage stagnation in the last 35 years is more critical than growth of inequality. And I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. What what makes you feel that that the wage stagnation is more paramount. And in case of that, there may be common underlying causes common to wage stagnation as well as
haven't thought through all the issues. Some people have. But I didn't mean to say it was only the top executives. I think it runs all the way through the firm. And in fact, we know that we would all like to make what mid-level executives make in some of these firms, I'm sure. Thank you all very much. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Miles.